And 80 this week, the father of minimalism, a man who inspired Brian Eno, John Cale and Stockhausen, the timeless music of Lamont Young.
I have always existed in my own world, but my work has the potential to have an effect over thousands of years in a way that is so powerful that it can create human beings who are totally different in character and personality and outlook and ideals because of the fact that one of their ancestors has had a certain kind of artistic experience.
On BBC Radio 3. Music by the American composer Lamont Young, inspired, like much of his output, by the hum of overhead high-tension electricity lines that he first heard when growing up in rural Idaho. He turned 80 this week. He's often been called the pioneering figure of minimalism. The father of us all is how Brian Eno once described him. Lamont Young's works are epic in scale. One of the most celebrated, the well-tuned piano, lasts 6.5 hours. Like many of his works, it presents a strange sound world, as it's written to be performed using just intonation, pure tuning, as opposed to the conventional equal temperament tuning we are used to. A road trip across America in the early 60s inspired many of his works that decade, which saw him establish a performing group, the Theatre of Eternal Music. In the 70s, he began a relationship with the Indian classical singer and teacher Pandit Pran Nath, which proved highly influential. Music is truly all-embracing for Lamont Young. He lives in New York, where part of his residence in Lower Manhattan became the Dream House, a specially created space that blends sound with the magenta light designs of his wife and long-term collaborator, Marian Zazila. Lamont Young, in his own words.
The music can appear to be not changing, this kind of theory of chaos where things are apparently the same, but little tiny differences make big differences eventually. Early on, you would find headlines in Newsweek, Lamont Young, Johnny One Note, or it was like people at first perceived that I was just doing something very simple, and then later on people began to understand that what I was doing was actually very complex, and that this simplistic level could act as a key to open locks and doors that could lead into a very complex world of the music.
His music is music for contemplation, for meditation. It lies at the edge of the intangible, but it does have an effect, a calming effect. I wouldn't say relaxing, but because your perceptions are increased.
Writer on music and professor at Liverpool's Edge Hill University, Richard Witts, who interviewed Young for the BBC in the 90s. More from that interview shortly, and we'll hear from the conductor, Richard Burness. Next month, Lamont Young's music comes to the Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival for the first time. Trumpeter Ben Neal will lead the Theatre of Eternal Music brass ensemble in The Second Dream, part of a much bigger work, The Four Dreams of China. I asked Ben Neal why Lamont Young is so important.
I think because he really is the first person to introduce the whole concept of minimal music through his use of extended drones. And then that evolved into minimalism as we know it, Terry Riley, Philip Glass, Steve Reich. Lamont's brand of minimalism, for the most part, was not what we necessarily think of in terms of rhythmic minimalism. It was really a reductionist approach based on long sustaining tones. It introduced that whole concept, which was very revolutionary.
When did you first meet him?
I met him in about 1983. I began studying with him and working closely with him. That was when I began performing this piece, The Second Dream, with him around that time. I've had an ongoing relationship with him ever since. He's very controlling in terms of who he allows to perform his music. He only wants it to be performed by people that have worked directly with him, been kind of in his inner circle. His reason for that is to keep a very sort of personal control over the way in which the music is performed at all times.
Short-term relationships are dangerous, he says.
Yeah. Yeah.
If the idea of controlling who performs it is one aspect of his uncompromising attitude, so too is the scale of a lot of works, the length. It's not very practical to do these sort of things often.
No, it's not. I mean, his music is not performed a whole lot because he does put extreme demands on the presenters and the performers. I'm very happy that we're performing The Second Dream again for some larger audiences.
You did it in Paris this week, and the promoters said, we need you to do 2 shows, because the first one sold out immediately.
Right. I think the simplicity of the works in terms of making a very large musical statement out of this kind of a reductionist vocabulary is perhaps something that is resonating very strongly with people right now in a world where we're bombarded with so much musical information, and I feel it's an aesthetic that is, kind of maybe finding a new interest.
To give The Second Dream its full title, The Second Dream of the High-Tension Line Step-Down Transformer. And this is something that goes right back to Lamont's childhood in Idaho, the sound of the power cables.
Yeah, he said that was one of the first sounds he remembered hearing was the buzzing of the power transformers up on the utility poles. So in the piece we use the Harmon mute, and the trumpets play down in the low register with the Harmon mute, which is an unusual use of that timbre, and it does create this very buzzing kind of sound. It's a very pure kind of experience that it's quite meditative. Of course, we always perform it in the magenta light environment of Lamont's wife, Marion Zazila. He's always had this element of light in combination with the performance of his music. Yeah.
What's he like as a person?
I think there's something very quintessentially American about him, in the best sense, the kind of iconoclastic composer artist, in the sense that he's very singular in his whole modality, this whole way that he dresses and everything that is very unique. It's a combination of sort of the Indian style of that he was adapted through his long-term study with Pandit Pranath, and this kind of biker aesthetic, So he is truly one of the most unique individual artists I think there is.
You have to remember that although Lamont Young is a composer, inasmuch as he chooses the sounds that he presents, the result is not necessarily a composition.
Conductor Richard Burness.
It's an environment that happens in a particular space at a particular time. And at the time that these were first devised, from about 1962 onwards, the concept of sound installations were that they were a protest against the concert experience of us all sitting in rows listening to the received wisdom of possibly a deceased composer, filtered through performers. This was instead something assembled by the musicians and performed in that time. There's a very New York profile that somebody comes in to the city and what they do becomes a transgressive act against what exists and is au courant, And he was really supported by the Dia Foundation. They'd bought a large mercantile exchange house in downtown Manhattan and converted it entirely for his purposes, and set him up with a large budget of about $500,000 a year. And he had something like 22 assistants to manipulate the dream house.
Lamont Young started his musical career playing saxophone in a Los Angeles jazz band. Richard Witts says one of his great achievements across his career is that his art has kept on evolving.
Lamont's output is often divided into three periods. In the 1950s on the West Coast, he was a rather precocious student whose trio for strings had an opening viola note lasting 4 minutes. And he showed an interest in that in serial music. It's Webern kind of slowed down and frozen and then opened out. And his second period ties in with his move to New York and the avant-garde Fluxus art movement there of the early 1960s and the mixing in with artists like Yoko Ono and filmmakers and so on. That's where he becomes most notorious. Some people deride Lamont's work because of his Dadaist text pieces from 1960, like, draw a straight line and follow it and turn a butterfly loose. But they were very much of their time in radically integrating elements of the New York art scene. Lamont turned his back on the Fluxus scene for being, I think, little more than a second-rate vaudeville. He thought it was just like a bad cabaret. But he retained its sense of theatre and ritual in his remaining work.
Your interview took place at his apartment in Manhattan, the site for the Dream House installation. What was it like meeting him?
Lamont and his partner, Marian Cecilia, they've got a loft in Tribeca on Church Street, and it's just before a very noisy junction. And the difference between the constant traffic and their own quietude is quite remarkable. And they're a spectacular couple. And you can tell that they were once ultra-fashionable proto-hippies because that's the way they've stayed.
Let's hear a bit of that interview. This is him talking about, the influences of other 20th century composers on his music, but also his background in jazz in Los Angeles.
What happened, is I started playing saxophone when I was 7 years old. My father taught me and was playing through LA City College, and really about 1957 I stopped and really wanted to go more deeply into composition because I had met Leonard Stein at LA City College, and he introduced me to Debussy and Stravinsky, and Webern, of course, was really very important. And
some of them must have sounded more old-fashioned than some of the modern jazz you were listening to.
Yes, to some degree. I mean, when you think of what the Miles Davis Birth of the Cool was doing, what was really important to me about it was that the element of improvisation was included. And I think we all know from an historical point of view that if we look back at Baroque times, Bach and others, and even into classic times, Mozart, they were great improvisers. But this aspect of our classical tradition sort of began to get lost, so that being involved in jazz really was very exciting for me.
He became a very good jazz player. He shared a desk with Eric Dolphy, for heaven's sake, and he played with Ornette Coleman over there in the late 50s. And he's a fine pianist, too. I mean, one of my favourite pieces is his well-tuned piano, which he plays. And you need a virtuoso technique because of the the way he's changed the intonation of the piano.
This is what he refers to as just intonation. Can you explain that?
Yeah, just means correct or pure. It's tuning by natural fifths rather than the equal step semitones that we're used to in what's called equal temperament. And it leads in Lamont Young's music to a novel and intriguing sound world involving psychoacoustics.
I saw him perform it in the late 80s at the Dia Art Foundation. I think that's the last time he performed it, I'm pretty sure.
Trumpeter Ben Neal.
When you tune the piano according to just intonation, you get all these overtones, subharmonics, resultant tones that you never hear when a piano is normally played.
And it sounds like you're hearing different instruments.
You think you're hearing voices sometimes. You think you're hearing, all kinds of different instruments, and also the extended duration of the music. One of the whole ideas around the extended duration is that as you listen to it for a longer period of time, the repetition of these frequencies in the ear actually, it's a kind of a cumulative effect, and so it really does become kind of more magnified or intense as the time goes on.
Young also used just intonation in his work with the Forever Bad Blues Band, which he formed in the 1990s, again creating a sound world that is both strange and familiar. Richard Witts.
Yes, and it's done much more slowly than a blues would be played. You are going into the blues. It's like you're exploring inside the blues. He's deeply influential. You have composers like Pauline Oliveros and Rhys Chatham. Stockhausen, Piano Piece 9 and Stimmung are influenced directly by Lamont Young. But he's also an influence in the rock music world. The Velvet Underground, John Cale, the co-founder of the Velvet Underground, played in Lamont Young's Theatre of Eternal Music and took the idea of drones into his rock band. And that's influenced thousands of rock bands. At the same time, nobody's ever really copied him.
Richard Witts on Lamont Young, who turned 80 this week. Ben Neal and the Theatre of Eternal Music Brass Ensemble will perform the second dream of the high-tension line step-down transformer from the Four Dreams of China at the Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival on Sunday the 22nd of November. Radio 3 will be there to report on the evening for Here and Now. That's it for Music Matters this week. Tom Service is here next week with the Australian pianist Roger Woodward and a new